First story, The Haunting Highway of Eldon. It was a foggy night on Route 86 just outside Eldon, Missouri. I had been hauling a load of steel beams to Kansas City and was hoping to find a quiet spot to rest. The highway was lonely, the kind of loneliness that makes you feel like you're the last soul on earth. As my truck rumbled down the desolate road, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was a woman in a long, tattered dress. Her pale face seemed to glow in the dim headlights. I slowed down, debating whether to stop or keep going. When I pulled over, she walked toward my window. Her voice was soft but urgent. "Can you help me?" she asked. "My son is lost in the woods." Something about her sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't just drive away. I grabbed my flashlight and followed her into the trees. The air grew colder as we ventured deeper. "Where did you last see him?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just kept walking ahead, her steps silent on the forest floor. Finally, we reached a clearing where a small wooden cross stood in the ground. "Here," she whispered, pointing at the cross. "He's here." I shone my flashlight on the ground. There was a fresh pile of dirt and a child's toy truck half buried in it. My heart pounded as I turned to the woman, only to find her gone. A low whisper rose from the trees. "Help me," a child's voice pleaded. I froze, unable to determine where the voice was coming from. Then saw him, a small boy with hollow eyes, standing just beyond the clearing. I took a step toward him, but the ground beneath me gave way. I fell into a shallow pit, landing on a pile of bones. Human bones. Panic set in as the boy and the woman appeared above me, their expressions void of emotion. "You should have kept driving," the woman said. Her voice was no longer soft. It was a cold echo of the wind. I scrambled out of the pit and ran back to my truck, not daring to look back. When I reached the highway, the fog had lifted, but the road behind me was gone. Only trees remained, as if the highway had never existed. To this day, I can't drive through Missouri without thinking about that night. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled, and some souls aren't meant to be found. Second story, Whispers in Cedar Hollow. It was a crisp October afternoon when my mother and I moved to Cedar Hollow, a small village nestled deep in the forests of Maine. The village had a population of barely 200, and most of them were elderly folks with faces etched by time. Mom said it would be a fresh start, but to me, it felt like we were stepping into a forgotten place that time had left behind. Our house was an old cabin at the edge of the forest. Its wooden walls creaked with every gust of wind, and the windows seemed to whisper secrets from the trees outside. The air smelled of pine and something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. That first night, I heard it, a soft humming echoing from the woods beyond our backyard. "Mom, do you hear that?" I asked, standing at the window with my 9-year-old sister, Leela, clutching my hand. Mom shook her head, but Leela whispered, "They call it the forest song. The lady next door told me it's how the woods talk to us. The next day, Lila and I explored the village. At the general store, we met an old man named Mr. Harrison. He looked at us with cloudy eyes and said, "You kids, be careful near those woods. People hear the song and never come back." That night, the humming grew louder. Leela stood by the window, her eyes wide with a strange gleam. "I think it wants me to follow," she whispered. I grabbed her arm and pulled her away, but I could feel the pull too, a siren call that dug deep into my bones. The next morning, Lila was gone. Her bed was cold, and the back door was ajar. I ran into the woods, screaming her name, but all I found was her stuffed bear lying at the base of a gnarled oak tree. The humming was everywhere, now surrounding me like a living thing. Days turned into weeks, and no one in Cedar Hollow seemed surprised that she was gone. "The woods choose who they want," Mr. Harrison said with a shrug. But I couldn't accept that. I went into the forest every night, following the humming until one evening I found her. Lila stood in a clearing, her eyes dull and empty. She was singing softly, her voice melding with the humming that surrounded her. When I called her name, she looked at me, but it wasn't Leela anymore. Something else wore her face. I ran that night, and I never stopped. We left Cedar Hollow the next day, but sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the song. Third story, The Shadows of Elmridge. It was a crisp October morning when I arrived in Elmridge, a quiet village nestled deep in the forests of Maine. I had moved here with my daughter, Emily, after a long and difficult year. The place promised a fresh start, but its silence felt heavier than peaceful. Our new home was an old Victorian house, tucked at the edge of the woods. The locals called it the Warden House, and while they didn't say much about its history, their hesitant glances spoke volumes. Emily, curious and bright for her 8 years, seemed fascinated by the house's creaking floors and twisting hallways. It was on the second night that the oddities began. Emily came running into my room, whispering, "Daddy, there's a boy outside my window." I checked, but there was nothing there except the trees swaying under the moonlight. I dismissed it as her imagination and tucked her back into bed. The next day, while exploring the woods, Emily found a small wooden box half buried in the dirt. Inside were a few old marbles and a faded photograph of a boy about her age. The back read, "Thomas Warden, 1923. Emily was delighted, claiming it was a treasure. That night, the air grew cold, and the house seemed to groan with every gust of wind. I woke to the sound of whispers coming from Emily's room. Rushing in, I found her sitting on the floor, talking to the empty air. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Thomas," she replied cheerfully. "He lives here. He says he's been waiting for me." A chill ran down my spine. I told her it was time to go back to sleep. But as I tucked her in, she grabbed my hand and whispered, He wants me to play with him in the woods tomorrow. The next morning, Emily was gone. Her bed was cold, and the front door was ajar. I searched the woods frantically, calling her name until my voice gave out. Hours later, I found her standing in a small clearing, clutching the box from the day before. "Emily, what are you doing here?" I demanded. "He says I can't leave," she said softly. Her eyes seemed distant, as if she was barely there at all. Before I could respond, a shadow passed between us. It was a shape like a child, but its features were indistinct, as if it was made of smoke. "Leave her," it whispered in a voice that echoed with ages. I grabbed Emily, clutching her tightly, and ran as fast as I could back to the house. But even as we crossed the threshold, I could feel the presence lingering just outside. We left Elmridge the next morning. The house and the village are behind us now, but sometimes at night I hear Emily whispering to someone in her room. She calls him Thomas.